The 1990s, an era and decade that many people consider the golden age of so many things in human history. Film was at an all-time high to some, with movies like Goodfellas, The Titanic, Malcolm X with Denzel Washington. Classic television sitcoms looked like it was peaking, with shows like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Friends, Living Single, and of course I can't forget about Martin. Hell, look at rap music. Jay-Z, Tupac, Biggie, Nas, the NWA. I could keep going about the great rappers of the 90s, but obviously you see the title of the video. This isn't about rap in the 90s. This is about another thing that many people believe was peaking around this time, the NBA. The NBA and fans who watched in that era have over-romanticized about the 1990s so much to the point that they have gone out of their way to discredit every single era since then. It truly is astounding to think about the things that players that played back then and the fans who watched back then say about some of the great players that we have in the league today. More specifically, LeBron James, for example. How many times have you heard these old heads say some of the dumbest things like LeBron wouldn't be able to hang in the 1990s? It truly is remarkable the lengths they go to quote-unquote defend their era, when in reality nobody ever disrespected the 90s to begin with. But now there's a new trend going around on Twitter and social media all over the place called "We Done with the 90s." And even though this trend is extremely flawed in its own right, I still do believe it's needed for basketball discourse to tip the scales back to being balanced. You see, because I do believe the 1990s is a great era for basketball. You could argue it's the best era of basketball. But when we compare eras in NBA history, we have to look at things relative to what they were. Because at the end of the day, it's simply genetics and common sense that humanity is going to evolve in all aspects. Players in basketball are going to get more skilled. Humans are going to get more athletic. When you have medicine and travel being different, it's going to affect the conditioning of these players and in turn also affect the product as a whole. Unfortunately though, the younger generation of millennials and Gen Z are completely fed up with old heads who say some of the craziest things about this generation of basketball.
He wouldn't have been a force back in the day. He would have struggled because they was making 2 jump shots, and he wasn't gonna be doing no Europe to the basket like he doing Euro step to the basket and just get layup. No, somebody gonna knock his head off. He been come on the bench back in the days.
I believe that Steph Curry is the greatest shooter God ever created.
I think, yeah.
Isaiah Thomas said to me one time, he said if he was playing in our era, he would not have averaged more than 18 points a game. The rules would have allowed them to rest on his shoulder and to be physical with him in such a way that he wouldn't have been able to get the shot off.
As you guys can see on the screen, this is Mark Price, one of the best guards of the 1990s. And in 1993, he was first team All-NBA with averages of 18 points a game, 8 assists, 3 rebounds, a steal, shooting 48% from the field, 42% from 3, and led the league in free throw percentage at nearly 95%. And if you see on the screen, Mark Price was not some incredible athlete, but it was quite the opposite, as athleticism was one of his weaknesses. But with his skill, his handle, his shooting ability, he was one of the most consistent players of the late 80s and early 90s. Just the mere idea of him being able to split a screen at the top of the key, it was almost impossible for teams to stop back then. And when you throw in illegal defense rules that made it very hard for defensive players for one-on-one isolation situations, it really goes to show you just how much Mark Price benefited from the era that he played in. Now replace Mark Price with better athletes, guys like Michael Jordan, who is one of the most unstoppable isolation players ever and one of the greatest athletes we've ever seen. Him getting the ball on the wing and basically being allowed to destroy people in one-on-one situations. Nobody would be able to stop him. Or even somebody like Charles Barkley, who despite being undersized was still one of the best athletes and rebounders we have ever seen at the power forward position. Before they added the back to the basket rule, he would back players down for hours, it felt like. Hell, look at Reggie Miller. he wasn't a great or phenomenal athlete, right? But because of his three-point marksmanship, he was able to extend his career longer than it really should have been. His foul baiting towards the second half of his career was incredible, kicking his feet out and flopping to get those 4-point plays or 3-point free throws. I really have to give him credit. He was able to manipulate the rules to benefit his own game. Or hell, even just the idea of pulling up for a transition three. That was unheard of in the 90s. My point in all these comparisons and bringing up these players is not to discredit what these players were able to do or accomplish in their era. It's to basically say that every single player in every single era, great or bench player, has rules that they can manipulate to their advantage no matter what. And for players like Charles Barkley to act like somebody like Giannis, if you put him in the 90s, is not exploiting things like illegal defense, is truly the definition of idiocy. Or somebody like Stephen A. Smith actually coming out of his mouth that Steph Curry wouldn't be able to get his shot off because they would quote unquote rough him up is the definition of goofiness. Curry is everything Reggie Miller is times 50 and has a handle. Sure, he's shorter, but he's a lot quicker and a better athlete. So to even entertain the idea that Steph Curry would be worse when it would actually be the opposite playing in the 90s is truly the epitome of comedy.
It was very physical. It was very volatile. It was an era made for the Kendrick Perkins of the world, for crying out loud. I'm talking about banging bodies.
Pause.
Jordan rules, people getting assaulted and only get caught for a foul. You know, having a foul called against the person that assaulted them, as opposed to today where you can get ejected for having bad breath. And LeBron James at 6'9", 260 pounds, is playing in the softest era we have ever seen in NBA basketball.
Well, there you go. When things like this are said in the media by people as prominent as Stephen A. Smith, it just goes to show why the younger people of this generation and beyond will continue to disrespect the 90s and previous eras before that. When you can go on TV and call an entire era of basketball soft because they're not going out there and assaulting people on their way to the basket, I mean, what are we even talking about anymore? Is assaulting people on their way to the rim playing basketball? No, it's not. These old heads and ex-players thinking that because they were tackling somebody on their way for a layup like the Jordan rules, that it means their era was harder or better. They have completely missed the point of basketball. Nobody is trying to watch jail hoops. That is not real basketball. We're trying to see you stop the other player from scoring without fouling. And the same thing goes vice versa, because we're not trying to see people Giannis their way to the rim on every single play. Could things be better in the league today? Of course. Could the refs call more offensive fouls or travels, carries? Of course. But I'd much rather see players play the way they're playing now versus back then when you got the Detroit Pistons on the schedule, so you gotta wear a flak jacket because you know going up for a layup you could get a broken rib. And I find it very ironic that Stephen A. can say LeBron isn't the GOAT because this era is the softest era in NBA history, but yet he's the same guy that said players back in the 90s feared Michael Jordan and the players today don't fear LeBron.
And all I can tell y'all is go back and talk to the players that went up against him. They feared MJ. Nobody feared LeBron. You were so scared of MJ, you were depressed the night before thinking about going up against that brother.
Look, man, I'm gonna be honest with you. If you fear another grown man, whether it's basketball related, personal life, whatever it is, it sounds like you're soft. And even if we go through this stupid logic of players being quote unquote afraid of Michael Jordan or afraid of LeBron James, what makes you think that players in the 90s were afraid of Jordan, but a team like the Toronto Raptors, who we all know LeBron had a psychological edge over? Hell, you've even said it yourself about the Raptors and LeBron. Old heads talk about Michael Jordan as if he's so head and shoulders above everybody else in NBA history from a psychological perspective, as if this man is God himself. Everybody was not afraid of Michael Jordan back then. That is just a lie. But yet when you raise Jordan to this pedestal, it's gonna put him at a standard that's really unrealistic and easier for the younger generation to tear down. We are in an era of basketball that is the golden age of offense because the league has innovated itself. You don't even have to go as far back as the 90s, just look at the 2010s. Players like Roy Hibbert were all-stars. Roy f***ing Hibbert. Joakim Noah, I love him as a Bulls fan, but he was an MVP candidate. Those were truly some dark times in NBA history. The big man position was at the worst it's ever been. But now there has been a surge in big man talent to the point that a guy like Karl Anthony Towns, one of the best three-point shooters in the league, is at the center position. And he's not even a top 5 big man in the NBA. You have centers and bigs that can handle the ball like a Nikola Jokic, a Giannis. They can create off the dribble with post moves and mid-range jumpers like a Jokic and Embiid. They can switch and guard multiple positions like a Draymond Green and Anthony Davis. These were not things that were requirements for big men back in the day. They were not things that were seen as necessities for big men back in the day. But yet, because they're not tackling somebody on their way to the basket, that means they're soft? No. If anything, the league right now is in a great place, in my personal opinion. There will always be things to fix about the NBA, whether you're in the 60s, 80s, 2000s, 90s, or right now in the 2020s. When you have the three-point shooting boom, it's gonna be a lot harder to play defense. The floor is more spread out than it has ever been. You don't have these two big lineups anymore that can't shoot. So at the very least, with a lot of these lineups, you got power forwards that can shoot, so the center is really the only non-floor spacer. And when it's set up like that, it's very hard for defensive liabilities to really be on the court for a long period of time. But now with offense booming the way that it has over the last decade, it's only going to make the offensive standard for defensive liabilities, no matter what position you are on the court, that much higher. So in conclusion, am I done with the 90s? No. There are great things you can pull from that era. I really don't care about those 10-second clips that people will pull up of the 90s that are bad lowlights, that make it look like Jordan didn't have a left hand or that they were airballing every single jump shot. Because if we really want to get nasty, I can pull up the worst clips from the Wizards games, the Pistons games, or hell, even teams like the Suns, Nuggets, Celtics. Out of context lowlights from any era can make you believe that any player is the worst thing you've seen since sliced bread. But I will say to the old heads and the ex-players out there, y'all put yourselves in this position to be judged this harshly by the younger generation. When you shit on this generation of players and you call them soft for every single thing that they do, you open yourself up for any kind of criticism, whether it's fair or not. So Gen Z, millennials, have at it, because the fact remains, we done with the 90s.